John Silber, the Chancellor, and Dennis Berkey, the Provost, extend their greetings. They're unfortunately out of town at a trustee meeting and couldn't be here, but if you look around, you can get some idea of how strongly John Silber feels about the Pardee Center. He's donated this space for the conference. This space has never been used before. It hasn't been inaugurated. We're the first users, so there may be some bugs in the system. Things may get worse as the day goes along, but hopefully everything will run smoothly. I'd like to introduce David Fromkin, who is the director of the Pardee Center. David.
Good morning. Is this? Yeah. Good morning. This conference is sponsored by the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, and by Mr. Pardee personally. On behalf of the center, on behalf of Mr. Pardee, welcome. And I know I speak for all of you in saying to Mr. Pardee, thanks for having made this possible. I'll turn this back over to Charles DeLisi, our chairman.
Just 2 minutes on the history of this. I'm on the advisory committee to the Pardee Center, and I missed a meeting once. And as a result, I was volunteered. And the original concept, I think, was proposed by Dave Campbell. He called it the humane genome. And maybe it should have had a question mark after it, the humane genome. In any case, speaking to Dave Fromkin, then he suggested human nature, the future of human nature. And it became immediately obvious that we can't discuss human nature by discussing genetics alone. The genome specifies a vertebrate vegetable and nothing more. We needed to have people who understood psychology, history, English literature, literature in general, not just English. That shows my chauvinism. And I was fortunate to find Kenneth Lewes to take up that range of jobs. Ken did his undergraduate work in English at Cornell, got a PhD from Harvard in literature, 17th century English literature. Taught at Rutgers for a while, went back, got a PhD in psychology, spent his career as a psychoanalyst, wrote, I think, what the New York Times refers to as the most definitive work since Freud in psychoanalytic theory, and is now an independent scholar living in New York, just finishing his first novel on 5th century Athens. And coincidentally, we grew up in the same neighborhood. Ken?
Hello. I'd like to welcome you all to our conference. If we've been the least bit realistic in our hopes and our expectations for it, we expect that you will leave here tomorrow bristling with more ideas than you could possibly handle. All of us, of course, are subjected by the media to daily predictions of what we or our children or their children could look forward to in the immediate future by way of developments that will extend and improve our lives. But a coherent and broad view of what the long-term future might bring us in terms of scientific and technological advances is not so readily available. Our hopes and ambitions for this conference are very grand indeed. If you should leave here without the fleeting suspicion that you've wandered into a convention of science fiction readers and writers, we would have to admit that we've at least partly failed in our project, or that we've been too timid in the way we've exercised our imaginations. In fact, we fully expect that you will hear today and tomorrow more than you can comfortably assimilate into your estimate of present human capacities or our knowledge of human history. Bearing that possibility in mind, I'd like to take a few minutes to sketch out some preliminary ideas and perspectives you might find useful in organizing and evaluating the welter of information, speculation, and facts that will soon be coming your way. In particular, I thought you might find it interesting to hear about how the theme of this conference developed. The first stirrings occurred in a discussion the organizers once engaged in concerning the 1933 intellectual exchange on the subject of war between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. The year previously, the League of Nations had commissioned Einstein to solicit the opinions of eminent intellectuals on topics of concern to those who wished to avoid another world conflagration like the one that had ended only 15 years previously. Einstein wrote to Freud, asking him why the project of banishing warfare from relations among civilized nations seemed to be proving to be such an intractable, if not impossible, task. To appreciate the full significance and poignancy of the exchange, we should, of course, remember the history of the period. In 2 years, Mussolini was to invade Ethiopia and to demonstrate, as a side effect of his campaign, the utter powerlessness of the League of Nations to fulfill its goal of preventing war. The Second World War, as you will remember, followed 6 years later. Freud's response, while interesting for many reasons, proved, however, not to be at all heartening to those like Einstein who shared a belief, or at least a hope, in the ability of men to resist the primitive and barbaric impulses toward war that had characterized past human history. Freud's thoughts were, in fact, very pessimistic. He thought that the best hope we could realistically entertain to avoid war lay in the establishment of an international body that had the power to enforce peace and could prohibit violence as a method of settling international disputes. But because such an organization would necessarily require from its members the relinquishing of certain aspects of national sovereignty, he was doubtful that it would ever come into being. But more important and more relevant for our present conference was Freud's idea that war has been so regular a recurrence in human history because it derives directly from an essential and irreducible component of human nature. In Freud's late thought, all of human behavior is powered by two forces. One of them, eros, seeks to unite, preserve, and cherish. But the other, the death instinct, opposes these ends and seeks instead only destruction and annihilation. Its mode is division, and the pleasure attendant upon its satisfaction derives from the spectacle of pain and destruction. Both instincts, eros and the death instinct, can either act on the self or on the outer world. Neither ever manifests itself in a pure state, but instead is always found in forms that are amalgamations of both. The manifestations of the death instinct could be clinical, as in depression or uselessly repetitive behavior, or historical, most dramatically as pointless and destructive wars. It's not my intention here to discuss or evaluate the truth or usefulness of Freud's conceptualization. The idea of a death instinct is difficult and obscure, and it never really caught on in psychoanalytic theory in general. Most psychoanalysts today, I would venture to say, have either repudiated the idea or currently ignore it. Still, once one has begun to think about it seriously, it returns again and again to haunt and impugn all one's benign hopes and fantasies for a better future. In recent days, especially now that we are again at war, it rises again above the horizon and calls into question all our claims and pretensions at having achieved any real measure of human progress or the fulfillment of pacific ideals. We find ourselves asking, was Freud right? Whatever one's view of the current war in Iraq, and however one analyzes the political forces, both overt and hidden, that determine this most recent resort to armed conflict, a sickening and discouraged feeling descends on many thoughtful and concerned people who consider any resort to violence as a failure of foresight and of the political process, and as a regressive capitulation to primitive instincts and motivations. The pleasurable excitement we see manifested around us as bombs explode on TV screens, or the smug provincial satisfactions we hear expressed over the visible evidence of human suffering, extinction, and despair, are in themselves sufficient justification for hard and sober thinking about future human progress. Especially when these evidences of brutality and primitiveness are juxtaposed to the technological wonders of modern weaponry, we must all be compelled to wonder just what relation technological progress and the furthering of scientific knowledge and understanding bears to the essential nature of human motivations, capacities, and satisfactions. The war is the war, and its pros and cons are more appropriately discussed elsewhere. Still, the consciousness of the present war, which bears heavily on us today, does provide a particular context, both moral and intellectual, against which to consider some of the ideas and speculations we are going to hear about in the next few days. Specifically, we will be compelled to consider the whole vexed and complicated relation of our progressive and increasing knowledge of the world to our own basic human nature, which inhabits and affects that world. I would like to spend a few minutes suggesting some of the darker questions we might ask ourselves when we are confronted, as we will be today, with visions of the glories of being able to understand and control the world. The most obvious question to ask, I suppose, is whether scientific and technological progress, which is now occurring at such an accelerated rate, is to be welcomed as the promise of a new Eden and a hopeful renewal of the world, or dreaded as the threat of a terrible nightmare and a generally encroaching psychosis. Should human beings, given what their nature is, be entrusted with the power that science and technology offers them? Or, on the contrary, have the age-old limitations on human power been all along a blessing and a protection from our own internal capacities for hatred and destruction? Just as the human body's ability to store fat has served it well throughout most of human history, but now, with changing social conditions, poses grave medical liabilities to health and longevity, so human aggression and its related idealization and sexualization of physical strength and violence may have outgrown their evolutionary usefulness and have themselves become one of the most lethal threats to our survival. One reassurance against this anxiety is the hope that science in the near future may be able to effect basic changes in human nature itself. If indeed a death instinct does constitute part of the human armory, will not, for example, neuropsychopharmacology be able to find ways of taming, controlling, redirecting, or even eliminating its baleful operations? Will peace pills, just like fluoride in the water supply, prove able to eliminate the age-old human miseries of war and violence? Or, more grandiosely, will technology be able to satisfy human needs and wishes in such abundance that one day greed and envy as motivations for human action will be eliminated? Maybe one day they will seem to our grandchildren to be traits as archaic, strange, and quaint as Achilles' spiteful anger at not having his Bronze Age martial honor acknowledged. We may in fact be able, with the new reproductive technology and forced speciation, to realize Plato's impossible dream and breed a species or even a race of philosopher kings. What heights, indeed, will life rise to when we are finally able to correct for all external deficiencies, inequalities, and differences that have crippled previous human societies? Will advances in genetics, will we be able to correct for all the internal ones as well? These advances extend beyond mere correction and amelioration of human defects and wants into the possibility of creating completely new genotypes and their resulting manifestations. In this brave new world of the future, and here I invoke only the ironic Shakespearean and not the horrifyingly Huxleyan one, might not the most important serious impediment to happiness and fulfillment prove to be boredom and a resulting general inexplicable purposelessness? Finally, who among us can say for sure whether that wished-for condition will prove to be a new paradise or the final inescapable nightmare? The very question of human nature, though quite abstract and complex, impinges directly and practically on our ability to imagine and plan a future. Are there, for example, constraints placed on possible developments by irreducible components of human nature? Freud thought there were. For him, instinctual frustration is always the price we must pay for living in civilized conditions. It is not clear, however, whether modern technologies will be able to avoid this paradox and provide us with pleasures and satisfactions that would have been unimaginable to Freud. On the other hand, the future could also could well end up damaging the basic human capacity to experience and enjoy happiness, to find an adequate sense of fulfillment, or even to have a real experience of our own inwardness. Are people today more contented, more fulfilled, or even more human than they were before they began to enjoy the benefits of modern technological progress? If there is such a thing as human nature that transcends historical conditions, can it provide a rule against which to measure, judge, and control the future as it comes ever nearer? We are very far from being able even to formulate these questions adequately, let alone to start resolving them. Finally, there still remains one even greater paradox that we must face. If human nature can be changed in basic, significant, non-trivial ways, then we must ask what, if not the needs and wants of human beings as we presently know them, what will determine the shape and direction of scientific and technological progress? Science, of course, possesses its own internal determinants of what direction it will take. Nature and the world out there present others, but there are other powerful vectors as well. Those of you who spend large parts of your day writing grant proposals do not need to be told that politics and political power largely determine what kinds of projects will be funded, encouraged, and elaborated. The present administration's position on reproductive technologies and stem cell research, to take only a few examples, suggests much larger and more worrisome issues. What kinds of questions are being asked today? Would it be pointless even to propose others to governmental agencies that are equally important and interesting? Let us not forget that knowledge, science, and technology, even when they are highly elaborated, widespread, and sophisticated, can fall into neglect and can even be forgotten. Archimedes, it seems, stood at the very threshold of discovering the calculus. Yet the practical, atheoretical intelligence of the world-conquering Romans could find no use for his insights and declined to elaborate them. The world had to wait for 2,000 years before the project was taken up again in an entirely different world and under entirely changed conditions. Similarly, the classical understanding of anatomy and the knowledge of how to represent the real world two-dimensionally were also gradually lost over a few hundred years as the classical age gradually declined. They had to wait for a full millennium for its rebirth. The modern world is, to be sure, different from other previous ages, most especially in the complexity and density of its systems of knowledge. Nevertheless, a longer historical view can be quite enlightening in the way it forces us to consider how contingent science and technology are upon practical conditions and economic forces. It surely does not have to be argued that the world of the future will be utterly remade under the influence of scientific and technological progress. No one would deny that such progress will have political consequences in ways that are difficult to imagine. Nevertheless, it is crucial that we also be aware of how politics, economic interests, and political power themselves can determine the very direction science and technology can take. We may one day soon rejoice to hear that peace has finally come to the Middle East. It may have happened because peace pills have been introduced into the water supply. One wonders, however, whether they will have been dissolved in Palestinian or Israeli reservoirs. Peace pills, the ability to choose the traits of our children, the control of social behavior, all have political determinants and consequences. Those of us who love science and whose self-pride and dignity as human beings resides at least partly in our wish and capacity for greater knowledge of the world, must constantly strive to keep human knowledge free of the struggle for power and dominance, for surely that dark ideal was included by Freud in his idea of the death instinct. Questions and warnings such as these are not new. In the past, they have proved to be useful stimuli for excursions into the realm of science fiction. The fact of the matter is that we are now standing in a doorway leading into a world where these unlikely possibilities are turning into facts. the imaginary issues and paradoxes that such writers as Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, or Arthur Conan Doyle once developed and elaborated to amuse their Victorian and Edwardian readers a century ago have turned into the realities of today. We must learn to look at them with a seriousness and steadiness that they never demanded of us before. Thank you.
I think that sets the stage for some of the challenges and reminders that we as a society in general and scientists in particular need to keep in mind. I was going to make some comments as a prelude to the next two talks on the size of the human gene pool as compared to the number of haplotypes that we know about, which is no more than 10 to the 10th, or that we can know about, that are expressed. One is an infinitesimally small fraction of the other. But I'm going to skip those quantitative remarks, just indicate that what you're going to hear represents a radically new approach. It's not acting on the phenotype, which drugs do, but it's acting on the genotype. And the range of possibilities, getting back to the previous remarks I just made, are just enormous. There's going to be more than just a continuum of personality types. The first speaker is Charles Cantor. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Charles is the leading bioanalytical chemist in the world. He's had a very distinguished career both in chemistry and in genetics. And in passing, he made a very fundamental contribution to evolution just when he finished graduate school. So it's a pleasure to have him here as the lead speaker. Charles.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me give you a little bit of background on where I'm coming from in what's, I hope, going to be a very provocative talk. I call this Human Evolution at the Crossroads, and if you had asked me to give this talk a decade ago, the conclusions would have been totally opposite. I would have said, none of this will ever happen. We will never allow it. But I've been forced to think about it a few times since then, and I changed my mind. The context in which I've been forced to think about this, on the one hand, is the sort of social implications of the kind of work my company does, and I'll briefly allude to that. But more importantly, as part of think tanks, both for defense intelligence and for the CIA, concerned with what technology is going to happen over the next decade or two that has a significant risk of destabilizing society as we know it. And in fact, in a CIA report that is not publicly available, but neither is it classified, it's just hard to get hold of, the conclusion is reached that what I'm going to tell you about today is the greatest threat to society as we know it, and it's genetic engineering of humans. I gave a very similar talk yesterday morning in Munich to a bunch of European venture capitalists and investment bankers. And at the end of that talk, someone came up to me and said, gee, I really enjoyed that, but how am I going to make money on it? Why should a venture capitalist care about this? And that's the danger, of course, is that we each tend to think of things from our own very narrow perspectives. And it's very hard to think outside the box, especially in things that, as you'll see, become really fundamental to what we are and what will happen to us. And one of the things I'll do in this talk is recommend occasional readings, mostly in modern fiction, that I think are relevant to some of the points I'm going to raise. Because I think good fiction always stretches the limits, if not actually manages to think out of the box. And so there's a lot of good food for thought, I think, in some of the things I'll mention. Now, evolution is subtle, but it's one of the aspects of, it's one of the few theoretical underpinnings of all of biology. And just to remind you, classically, evolution is viewed as the fittest species survive. It's really planetary. It's the whole ecosystem that evolves. Fitness is very boring. It's just the number of fertile offspring. That's all evolution cares about, is be fruitful and multiply. And because it takes place in a, we know, fluctuating environment, evolution itself is not a continuous, gradual process, but it occurs in fits and starts. So a very recent drug industry magazine had this view of evolution, here's the reference, on the cover. And you can see, if you look at this for a second, how incredibly biased this drawing is, because it implies by white that evolution has stopped. There is no color beyond white, okay? So that, as I'm going to try to argue, is just not true at all. And it's the issue that we have to confront. Not only has evolution not stopped, but it's probably about to go much faster. Now, to explain the forces that underlie evolution just a bit, we are, every species, basically are a convolution of the genes that were dealt with at birth and the environment that we experience throughout, well, after really conception. And that leads to traits, or what geneticists call phenotype. And clearly what's interesting is phenotype. Any attempt to make predictions from genes alone or from environment alone inevitably fails. And the issues are also so complex that although they may be deterministic at some level, it's a little hard to make good predictions. For those of you who are not geneticists and would like to learn something that is very well written and goes beyond what you've learned in school, this book by Laura Gould, Cats Are Not Peas, obviously a pun off of Mendel, points out some of the complexities of genetics that actually occur in species like cats or people. Very well written, and I recommend it. The problem that we have to confront, the crossroads of my title, is that I believe that evolution is changing now. It's not the same anymore. It is still the best genes for a given environment, but the problem is that we control the environment. And as a result of sequencing the human genome and the growth of genetic engineering and so on, we control the genes. And the change in my thinking was to realize that these accomplishments, if you will, are the logical next steps in evolution. A species evolves to the point where instead of being simply buffeted by the evolutionary force, it steps in and controls them. And that's the power that we have. And what makes this a very interesting topic is, at least thus far, as I've been able to tell, the Eastern and the Western traditions approach this issue differently. The East embraces it, the West is abhorred by it, and we're going to have to deal with that, because this is where a great schism in the society, I think, could arise. So what I'm saying here in a little more detail is that natural selection is no longer the process. It's now artificial selection. Depending on the choices that are made, it is the fittest species can be simply the one that does the selection. And here's an interesting thought. Males become unnecessary. Because once you're doing genetic engineering, you need females, but you don't need males anymore. Cloning can be done on females. It cannot be done on males unless you have the mother. Now, will we do away with males? I think that remains to be seen. And if you want some interesting counterexamples of why we shouldn't do away with males, I can recommend Norman Rush's Mating, which won the National Book Award for Fiction about a decade ago, John Barth's The Last Voyage of Somebody the Sailor. And for those of you who speak some Russian or French, or preferably both, and can get through it, Nabokov's Ada is a masterpiece, but very, very challenging. At least it was very challenging to me. Okay, so why should we be concerned with this now? Well, 100 years ago, DNA was unknown. 50 years ago, this is the 50th anniversary of Watson and Crick and the recognition that genes were DNA. So given the speed of process where we now have the entire DNA sequence and understand many of the rules for most species, 50 years from now, what is it going to be like in terms of DNA technology? I would argue that nobody in this room can make an accurate prediction of where the technology will be 50 years from now. And based on past experience, any prediction, even the most outlandish, is going to prove to be too conservative. Right, so the Human Genome Project has given us a detailed street map of the genome. Basically what we had before was a map with interstate highway system on it that you really couldn't use to find something specific. Now we can find anything we want to rapidly, and I'm going to try to prove that to you with just a segue into what Sequenome does. So Sequenome does high-throughput human genetics. We discover genes that underlie complex human traits. Because we're a commercial entity, the genes we're interested in discovering are those of commercial importance. And today, primarily, we focus on genes that underlie complex human disease, not rare Mendelian disease that affects one person in a million, but complex human disease that affects everybody in this room. And in the last 18 months, I think I can argue convincingly that we have done more human genetics than has been done in the history of the planet because of the rate at which we can do this. So we built this automated system, which I won't describe in detail, but it does human genetics. And it makes up to 200,000 human genetic measurements a day, and we keep it running continuously. Right? And so we've taken this through a whole bunch of clinical trial populations, case control studies, and have used it to discover genes that underlie most diseases that we care about. So we understand, at least as much as we're going to for the moment, about skin cancer, morbidity is really cardiovascular disease, breast cancer, adult diabetes, HDL is more cardiovascular disease, osteoarthritis is a cartilage disease, lung cancer, schizophrenia, that was last year, and this year we're working our way through most of the other diseases that are commercially interesting. We are finding genes that account for about 25% of each of these diseases on average. And this is absolutely staggering. People would have argued that you couldn't find anything because it would be too complex. And we can't find everything, but we're really making inroads. And I would like to prove to you, because there have been so many claims in the past that human genetics will do this, that, and the other thing, and it never turns out to do anything. I would like to try to prove to you that this time it's for real, and I'll do that in two ways. So this is looking at the sort of 50 candidates of halfway through our process for osteoarthritis, a cartilage disease, for schizophrenia, a mental disorder, and this is looking at candidates which are known to be associated in one way or another with ordinary housekeeping functions. This should have been psychoses here, but the label dropped off, and chondrocytes and cartilage. And you can see that in the cartilage scan, we pick up preferentially genes which have some annotation, which means if we know anything about their function, it has something to do with cartilage. In the schizophrenia scan, we pick up things which have links to disease, such as dopamine metabolism and brain ion channels and so on. And there's no selectivity for housekeeping. That's one way of doing this. The second way to try to prove to you that we're really finding the right stuff is that in a few cases, before we did these studies, there were one or two genes that were known to be associated with diabetes. And we do these studies blind. The people doing the work are just, everything is numerically coded. They have no idea what they're looking for. So the question is, do we rediscover in a blind search things which were already known? And the answer, yes, is we rediscover everything that's known for HDL plasma levels, CETP, lipoprotein lipase, for diabetes, PPAR gamma, and this thing. The most impressive of these in skin cancer, we discovered BRAF kinase before the publications showing a somatic association of gain of functions of mutations in malignant melanoma and in precancerous moles. So in this case, there was no way we could have cheated the system because we got there first. Okay, now what does this mean? It means that medicine will change in fairly dramatic ways because these inherited differences that predispose to disease will have to be addressed. And this will require individualized therapy. And in order to do that, I think it will require reworking of our entire healthcare system and insurance system. But for the purposes of this meeting, more important, we will be able to treat some gain-of-function mutations traditionally with drugs. We'll be able to treat some loss-of-function mutations traditionally with biological therapeutics like insulin. But I can tell you that at least half the targets that we find that are responsible for human disease are not addressable with traditional therapy. And so to address them, and that's something we do want to do, it's going to require, at least from what we know at the moment, it's going to require some kind of gene-based therapy, either, and I'll come back and talk about the types in a moment. Right? So there's going to be a tremendous driver from the healthcare system in order to contain disease to develop gene therapy. Let me just point out where the healthcare system has to go. This is actually a ripoff of a quote from Bill Hazeltine, the CEO of Human Genome Science. Our goal should be the elimination of the healthcare system. And the argument here is it's just postpone disease until after death. Right? If you think of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, that was one way of doing it. Is this a realizable goal? Well, let me turn it around and say I don't really think we have much choice. Because the current healthcare system will crash. It will economically self-destruct. And medicine has to change from a reactive mode to a preventive mode. And that's the only way that anybody knows, that at least I've ever heard, that we can bring down costs and still deliver effective healthcare. Right now, aging is honestly an awful process for most people. And as you get sicker and sicker and more infirm, and for some interesting and very poignant discussions of what it's like to age, I recommend a few things. Will Self's How the Dead Live is an extraordinary and frightening novel about life after death. William Boyd's Any Human Heart is a very interesting discussion of aging, as is Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections, which won the National Book Award for Fiction last year. And more peripherally, but a great book about human genetics, is Jeffrey Eugenides' Middlesex, which, as the title might imply, is about a hermaphrodite. But it also deals quite a bit with aging. And so I recommend these as stimulating food for thought. Gene therapy. Since I go first, I'll introduce it. The part which is relatively non-controversial is somatic, where you would use a virus or stem cells that would not enter the germline, and so not be inherited, merely be palliative and then disappear when the organism disappears. What's more troublesome, because it's permanent, is to use embryonic stem cells. There are other ways, but this is the effective strategy today. And this is permanent, and it's passed on to the offspring. Now, don't worry yet, because human germline gene therapy, human cloning, is not ready for prime time. It's not ready for prime time because it's not that you couldn't do it, but that you'd have so many failures for every success that it probably would be intolerable, both in terms of cost and in terms of trauma. But I think it's only a matter of time before human cloning and human germline gene therapy becomes fairly standard. And I think a number of forces will drive that. Now, if you think of European tradition today, they are paranoid, not just about human cloning or ES cell work, but about any genetically modified organisms. If you go to China, they're doing it. They're embracing it. India, it's all over. One of the things that really stimulated my thinking about all this was a meeting, a rather extraordinary engineering meeting that was held 2 years ago in Beijing, where I heard, admittedly in a very large room, the premier of China say, "We will use genetic engineering to change our people to reduce our healthcare costs," unequivocally. All right? Now, I'm not going to be surprised when the Chinese field an 8-foot-tall basketball team at the Olympics. The only question is which Olympics, but I think it's fairly inevitable. And in case you're wondering about this, with the latest high tech, there are no traces left. You have no way of knowing whether manipulation was natural or artificial. You simply cannot tell, all right? And are we going to say foul, that that's not fair, that they are 8 feet tall now? And, I don't know. Now, to address whatever ethical concerns there are, or practical concerns, let me just indicate that gene-line gene therapy today is already practiced on a large scale in China and India. And it's done by the process of sex-selective abortion, which is dramatic germline gene therapy because it does away with the whole chromosome. Now, if you haven't read these statistics, in some provinces in northern India, the sex ratio at birth, males to females, is distorted to the point of being 4:3. So this is not a rare event. In these regions involving hundreds of millions of people, there's a tremendous bias towards males. And the reason is not sexist, it's economic. And that is, at least in Indian culture, the bride price or dowry that's required for a female child is enormous, and most families can't bear it. And so they want to have male children so that somebody else pays for the wedding and so on, right? So I would argue that your Pandora's box is open, and this is not going to go away. All right, now, if we get back to who will direct this process, to me, it's sort of scary. I won't be around to see it, fortunately, but I don't know if it's going to be possible to have a uniform set of rules here. I don't know that different cultures will agree on that. But I want to re-emphasize that the person who does the selection is potentially the survivor. Now, I believe, going back to that picture I showed you of human evolution, that we are not its culmination. It's going to go on. Now, how to predict how it's going to go on? Well, I think the bottom line is we really don't know today. There are some interesting possibilities. Philip Kerr, in a book called Esau, has a very interesting hypothesis that the abominable snowman exists and is, in fact, the next higher form of humanity. Just the opposite view is taken in a marvelous book by Will Self called Great Apes, in which a person awakes one morning to discover that he is a chimpanzee. In a world where run and completely controlled by chimpanzees, but he believes that he's a human imprisoned in the body of a chimpanzee. This, of course, makes him mentally ill from the viewpoint of the Chimpanzee Society, and they attempt to treat him. There are a lot of arguments to make that we ought to try to figure out how to do carbon-silicon chimeras, but I think the answer is nobody can predict this today. But we can predict certain things you shouldn't do. The number one pitfall as humans go forward and control evolution, the number one pitfall is do not go down the road of homogenization. Evolution always favors diversity because it allows for survival in case the environment turns sour. Now, if it were not for the CCR5 mutation, which a small fraction of people carry, if HIV had been easily transmitted, the whole planet would be wiped out. But there are people who are immune. Very few, but there are some. Homogenization is already boring, to echo something that Ken mentioned in his comments. I think we have to be very afraid of being bored in the future, but not everybody agrees with that. Just imagine what we did with dogs by conventional breeding, not genetic engineering, just slow conventional breeding over, admittedly, thousands of years. Dogs differ in size by orders of magnitude, whereas humans, not even a factor of 2. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. I'm not certain that we'll recognize humans in 200 years. That is, if one of us could suddenly take a trip forward 200 years in a time machine, I'm not sure that we'll recognize what humans look like. Now, that's a very aggressive statement. But the reason why I can be that aggressive is that we have the tools today. We don't fully understand them yet. We have the tools today not just to control evolution, but to speed it up in a massive way. So in order to propagate things, you have to see what you've done. Right? But it's possible to speed up propagation. And Goran Sandberg in Umeå in northern Sweden is the world's expert on poplar tree genomics and genetics. And the problem in studying poplar trees is that normally it takes 20 to 30 years before they produce seeds. And so each cycle of discovery and enhancement, if you will, is almost a lifetime. And, but Sandberg has been able to find a mutant poplar tree in tissue culture that flowers in 16 weeks instead of 16 years. And that's a tremendous advance. So he will now be able to engineer the poplar tree very, very quickly. And I believe it should be possible to do the same things with humans, if you want to, and speed up the process so that in just a few years you could produce something novel. I think, I honestly don't know how to close this door. Okay? That is, I think, so to speak, the cat is out of the bag. Evolution is now in our hands. I only hope we have the wisdom to use it wisely. And I think meetings like this are a very good first step at trying to come to grips with what does use it wisely mean in this instance. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
You and Lee together.
As you wish, whatever.
Together to take questions
Okay.
right after this talk.
Okay, let me give him the PowerPoint. Oops. Wait a minute.
Lee Silver is a very distinguished geneticist, professor of molecular biology and public affairs at Princeton, and a teacher in the broadest sense of the word, not just in the classroom. And for those of you who haven't read Remaking Eden, I would highly recommend it. And his remarks are going to be, I think, central to this, to the scientific part of this meeting, and it should interface quite nicely with what Charles just said. Lee.
It's going to take me just a minute to hook up the technology. Is there a technical person? Show me. Just need an electrical hookup. The electrical hookup.
It's going to be a tight fit.
And maybe I'll. Sounds good. There we go. Okay. Very interesting to follow Charles Cantor in a discussion, because usually when I give my talk, I'm totally out of left wing, but I now see that Charles is out on the left wing or right wing, whatever wing, with me. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the points that actually Charles has already talked about, but I think the one thing I want to focus about on my first slide is who might use this technology. And I think it's very important to understand that in a liberal democratic society of the kind that we live in and the kind that many economists think the whole world is moving toward, it's individual parents who have the choice of what they do with their children in their lives. Today, they can provide their children with whatever environmental advantages they can afford, like spending $150,000 to send them to Princeton University. And although they give you all sorts of reasons for spending this amount of money, basically they do this because it increases the chances that their child will be successful in life. Happiness, I think, is highly overrated. Extreme happiness and contentness, which we all think we're aiming to, was not evolutionarily advantageous. If everybody was happy and content, we'd never go anywhere, basically. Those are the guys who die off. So it might be a good kind of thing, but what parents are trying to get out of Princeton University is success. They want their kids to be able to make money and then have kids beyond them who make money. I think that's what's going on there. Of course, there's no guarantee. Tomorrow, if the technology exists, produced by Charlie Cantor's company, for parents to provide their children with genetic advantages prior to birth, will they use it? That's the question. So the technology that I'm talking about, focused totally on the technology, is a combination. The DNA chip is sort of an icon for genetic technology, but genetic technologies are actually much more broad than just the DNA chip, but it's a beautiful icon. The notion is that you can, today, we're on the verge of being able to very rapidly look at all of the genes that exist within a genome. And when that technology, which was developed for purposes of overcoming disease, basically, when that technology is combined with reproductive technology, which has been developed in a very, very separate group of scientists for a totally different purpose, which is to overcome infertility. And so the guys that have developed these two different kinds of technologies haven't really talked to each other yet, even though their technologies are very powerful. When those technologies come together, you get reprogenetics, reproductive and genetic technology, which would allow the use of genetic information or technology by an individual in an attempt to ensure or prevent the inheritance of particular genes in their child during the course of reproduction. I think the important thing here is that this is not the same as Huxley's feared Brave New World. Maybe it's just as fearful. But the difference here is I really don't think that there are going to be governments telling people what to do. I think that it's going to be individual parents, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment, individual parents, just like the ones I was talking to at my dinner table last night, who are trying to do what they think is best for their children. And that's who's going to, I think, prospective parents are going to embrace this technology. So the genetic engineering of human children to be. So these are the questions I thought would be worth approaching in this talk. Can it be done? Should people do it? What could it actually accomplish? Will people really do it? And then what are the consequences? And I think I've reordered two of these, but I'll keep on coming back to this slide as I go through each step. Okay, can it be done first? Well, what if leading? Let's look in the past. It's very useful to look in the past, and I was very pleased that Charles said that 10 years ago he would have thought that no, it couldn't possibly be done. I want to give you a quote from Jacques Monod, a very famous molecular biologist, one of the fathers of molecular biology, wrote a beautiful book called Chance and Necessity in 1970. He was a brilliant man. He said, modern molecular genetics offers us no means whatsoever for acting upon the ancestral heritage so as to improve it with new features. And why is that the case? The genome's microscopic proportions today and probably forever rule out manipulation of this sort. So in 1970, Jacques Monod said genetic engineering of anything is impossible, probably forever, because DNA is so small. Okay, that's what he said. Now, you all know, and 3 years later, genetic engineering of bacteria took place. In 1980, genetic engineering of mammals took place for the first time. This is my icon of genetically engineering a mouse embryo. And now there's no question that you could genetically engineer anything that you want, and germline genetic engineering of animals and and plants. And there's not a question of can it be done. Now people are worried about the consequences of it being done. So we've gone, and this is 1970. We're talking about 33 years ago that was said. In 1985, Maxine Singer, another famous molecular biologist, was at a bioethics conference, and there were a bunch of bioethicists standing around, sitting around, arguing about the ethics of genetic engineering of humans, and she basically said, "Shut up! You shouldn't even have this argument because genetic engineering of humans will never happen for the simple reason that it will never be possible to do safely or efficiently. Thus, bioethical debate is an utter waste of time." Some molecular biologists, and of course, you know, she was a kind of a strong person, so everybody shut up. But what do we now know? Well, new technology. I mean, this is the problem with scientists. Some scientists are unable to realize that technology may explode far beyond what we can even conceive of today. And this is just sort of an example of, you know, putting together cloning, cell cloning technology and DNA chip technology. The idea is that you can take technology which would overcome this problem with safety and efficiency. When you're just injecting DNA into an embryo, it's very inefficient, it's very unsafe. But if you put all of these steps in where you do all of your selection up front, and you get your cell and you know that it's okay, and you've looked at the whole genome and it's fine, and then you put that nucleus into an unfertilized egg, you actually got that technology to work. Well, see, this makes it conceivable. And now I want to tell you, this is not ready for prime time. This is not going to happen tomorrow. There's no question about that. We're discussing the future. We're talking academically about what's going to happen. So I get very upset when people say, oh, well, you know, we have to worry about this right this minute. We don't. But the point is that this is no longer impossible. That's the point that I want to make with this slide. So cell cloning DNA microarray analysis potentially provides safe and efficient method. And beyond DNA microanalysis, there are other technologies. Should people do it? Okay, that's the second question. This is what Bridget Hogan, another famous molecular embryologist, said in 1999 in the New York Times. She said, "I think the technique is far too risky and it's unlikely to ever be perfected at the stage when it is absolutely 100% reliable, which is what one," there's a word missing there, which is what one would have to insist on. So Bridget Hogan said, well, it's never going to be 100% reliable. That's absolutely true. Nothing's ever 100% reliable. But she's saying that if it's not 100% reliable, we can't do it. So how valid is this claim if you do a standard risk-benefit analysis? Well, I always like to give my students an example of a different reproductive technology and show the risks involved. And I'll tell you what the technology is in a minute. The risk of serious harm to prospective mothers is 2 to 10%, depending on where it's carried out. Risk of death to the embryo is 50%. The risk of death to the fetus is about 25%. Risk of a live-born child with a serious birth defect could be anywhere from 4 to 28%. I gave this talk at NYU Law School and said, should this high-risk repro technology be banned? Those of you who are laughing have a little bit of medical knowledge and you realize that this is the risk of babies with sexual intercourse between fertile people. The risk of live-born child with the birth defect rate is up to 28%. Actually, the horrible thing happened to my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, discovered recently after a couple of failed attempts that they are actually both carriers for 2 recessive diseases. And so their risk, if they rejected abortion, decided they were going to have a baby no matter what, if they got pregnant, their risk of having a serious birth defect is 43%. Now, in fact, they're going to choose technology to overcome that. But that's just to give you an idea of what the risk is by sexual intercourse. If the objection to any repro technology is based simply on the risk of the child, the objection evaporates when the technology becomes less risky than reproducing naturally. In other words, there are other objections you can make, but when Bridget Hogan gets up there and says, no, and this is a lot of the objections that bioethicists make to cloning, oh, it's too risky. Yeah, that's true right now, but then, if we get to the point where it's not risky, what's left? What's the objection? Well, there's one other hidden objection that I want to come to because it's a very important objection that people try to ignore, okay? And it has to do with the human soul. Okay, there's this notion that my son on the left there has a human soul, and the animal on the, I'm sorry, my son on the right. Sometimes he looks like a monkey, right? The chimp on the left either has a chimp soul or no soul. I actually did a survey of Princeton students. 80% of Princeton undergraduates believe there is a human soul of some kind. This is among the most educated people in the country. Whether or not a chimp has a soul, it depends on how you define a soul. But some people think the chimp has a soul, some people think not. But clearly they think the human soul is different than whatever the chimp might have. Now, as scientists, we know that both of these come from an embryo which is basically indistinguishable. I couldn't find a chimp embryo, but the embryologists I talked to say it's impossible to distinguish a chimp embryo from a human embryo. So you have these two embryos, they're virtually, not just virtually, they're indistinguishable at this point. And really the only difference between these two embryos, so here you have these two embryos, they have tiny little differences in their DNA, and those tiny differences in DNA give you either a chimp soul or human soul. This is a gene that I sequenced when I was still doing research in the laboratory between human and chimp. You see the little yellow letters, those are the human bases. And to molecular biologists, we don't know which ones they are, but there are human-specific DNA bases that guide human-specific development. That's what molecular biologists think, okay? And what molecular biologists think is that if you look at the pattern of human evolution over the last 3 million years, those little green dots, this is sort of a rough, this is the brain size of all of these fossil pre-humans, which is a kind of a rough estimation of the intelligence levels of these pre-humans, and you can see how it exploded over the last 3 million years, from Lucy, Homo habilis, to Homo erectus and Homo sapiens up here. Our intelligence exploded over the last 3 million years, and so the question is, who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for this explosion in brain capacity over the last 3 years? Well, scientists and 5% of Americans, actually fewer than 5% of Americans, say natural selection of random events. In other words, there were random genetic changes that were exposed to natural selection, and so some changes provided greater fitness, and those are the changes that made it forth to Homo sapiens. 5% of Americans think that. 45% of Americans said it was God. In other words, yes, evolution occurred, but God chose the DNA changes along the way. Okay, that's what 45% of Americans think. There's still 50% of Americans left. God started at the top. Okay, none of this happened. Okay, so this is interesting because it basically says 95% of Americans essentially think we owe our genes to God. I mean, people are actually very knowledgeable. Some say maybe they misunderstand it a lot, but people know there are genes. They understand that genes are important in our development, and 95% of them, based on this kind of a reasoning, would say we owe our genes to God. So what do they think about controlling the genes we give to a child? Here's a survey that was done in Harper's Magazine, which said, who should control the genes we give to a child? A geneticist would say, well, it's just random, 25, 25, 25 possibility of a mutation. Just in terms, I'm just talking now not about genetic engineering, just about selecting the genes that go from one locus to the offspring. But if you ask people who should control the genes given to a child, 11% say the parents should control it, 0.7% say the doctor. We don't trust doctors very much. 16% said no one, and 70% said God. So basically, if you ask people this question, this specific question, 70% say God should control the genes. That makes perfect sense because God gave us our genes, therefore God should control the genes that we give to our children. The no one is very interesting because when I talk to people who actually, I've talked to people who say no one, they're thinking of a different kind of God very often. They're thinking of a Mother Nature God, sort of a version of, well, nature knows what it's doing, even though they don't think they believe in God. What will people really do it? That's the next question. Okay, same survey. This is the first answer they had. Same survey, they said, okay, eventually genetic technology may allow a couple to control certain characteristics of their unborn child. If you're expecting a child, how important would controlling the following characteristics be to you? And then they listed a series of characteristics and said, would you want to control the genes for these characteristics? First one was disease immunity. 84% said yes. So in the same survey, within a matter of minutes, people changed their mind and said, no, God should do it. When they said, what about disease, giving your child disease immunity? And people said, oh, forget God. Okay, I'm going to control the genes. With intelligence, 64% said it. And this is without even a chance to think. This is basically the same survey. Sexual orientation, 51%, which actually I think is it's an interesting number, because I'm sure 20 years ago, when there was much less acceptance of sexual orientation differences, that number would have been much higher. Gender, only 19%. In the United States, actually, there is no preference for boys or girls. If you ask people what they think the perfect family is, they say one boy and one girl. They want the boy first and the girl second. But in fact, people generally want equal numbers of boys and girls in the United States. So we're not going to have the same problem as they have in some third world countries. What are the forces that will drive the development of high-tech reprogenetics? I really think it comes down to individuals. I think it comes down to human nature. I think it is human nature to desire to advantage one's children. I think that any parent in this room has this desire. And the marketplace response, which exists in the United States. I'm going to give you an example of this marketplace response in those extreme situations where a woman cannot make her own egg. So she's going to have a child, but she needs another egg to have a child. And in those extreme situations, she will advertise in Princeton University newspaper. This is an advertisement in 1999, but in fact, these kinds of advertisements are every single day. They're looking for an intelligent, athletic egg donor, large financial incentive. They're willing to give $50,000 for this egg donor. These days, the advertisements, the market is sort of cleared, and it's about 25,000 sort of every single day in the student newspapers, the price that people are giving for these kinds of characteristics. So people are today willing to do this. They're willing to buy these kinds of characteristics. They would prefer to have their own genes, I should say. This is really a last resort. People don't do this when they are fertile. They do this when they're infertile and they have to buy sperm or eggs. The same thing happens with buying sperm. It's just that you can buy a 6-foot-tall physics major at Harvard with straight A's. All you have to do is pay him $250 for a sperm, and he'll give it to you. So that's the difference in the sperm market and the egg market, which is why people don't make a big deal about the sperm market. What can it actually accomplish? This is back in the days of what genetic engineering did, when people really had no idea what genes were. And yet this is what they were able to accomplish over here, taking a single species. We now know all the dogs in the world come from a single species in Central Asia. A single species of gray wolf. You pull out all, I don't know dogs very well, I just know it's a French poodle. You pull out all these different dogs, which not only look different, but they have a different nature. They're not big bad wolves anymore. They're lap dogs. They are empathetic. All of these behavioral and physical characteristics have been completely altered in these animals. I think another incredible case is this weed which grows in Mexico, and the Mexican Indians took this weed and turned it into corn. And this is absolutely remarkable. I mean, this weed over here is the same size as this over here. And so over a very short period of time, actually, they were able to take this and breed it into corn, not having any idea what they were doing, but clearly selecting certain genes that were able to totally change the characteristics of this organism over here. This is a sheep. I love this sheep because most people don't realize we created wool. Wool does not exist naturally. This animal came from a goat that had hair. And through a process of breeding, we created an animal that had wool. So we created a new textile by genetic engineering, the old-fashioned way. Just to give you an idea of what, this, I'm not saying this is going to be done. I'm not saying anybody would want to do this to your children. But just to give you an idea of what could be done. This is in a paper that appeared last year, which talking about genetically engineering a single mouse gene, one mouse gene. And they engineered the mouse gene as a mouse gene that regulated the control of cell cycle exit and normal precursors. What that means is they changed the gene. So normally this gene controls how often the cells in the cerebral cortex divide. Now what happens, you realize, is that if there's one more division of all those cells, that doubles the size of your cerebral cortex, okay? And here they got these mouse out. Transgenic fetuses have grossly enlarged brains with a considerable increase in the surface area of the cerebral cortex without a corresponding increase in cortical thickness. That's what's happened during human evolution. They can do that right now in mice, okay? I'm not saying we want to do it in humans, but to give you a sense of the technology really is powerful, and we're going to have a lot of knowledge. We don't have it yet, but the knowledge is going to happen. Is it ethical? Is it fair? Not everybody's going to be able to afford this technology. Well, I want you to think about this, and I'm going to give you an example of a natural variation that exists across the human population. It's a variation in height, okay? This is the bell curve in height across the normal male population. It turns out that every added inch of height up to a point provides an advantage in life. This is a statistical fact. It means that if you look at all the men in the country that are my height, I'm short, and then you go inch by inch by inch, and you look at what their salary is. And the salary goes up and up and up and up and up, every single inch, up until there's a cutoff. I don't know exactly where the cutoff. There's a cutoff where the salary drops when you're a freak because you're too tall. But every inch of height up to a point, which means there's a huge difference in the salary that somebody of my height, for example, and I'm down on the bottom side of this curve, huge difference in the salary that somebody of my height, on average, gets versus somebody on the other side. This makes perfect sense if you think about CEOs of companies and presidents of the United States, and their average height is not the same distribution as the height for the population as a whole. Now, this is the question to ask yourself. There's no question that this person has an advantage at birth. He does. Everything else being equal, he has an advantage over that person at birth. The question is the very real advantage of being naturally tall fair or unfair? The advantage is there. Is that fair or unfair for certain boys to be born with this kind of advantage? Is becoming tall through a genetic add-in fair or unfair? So all your parents are going to try to do is say, okay, my kid would probably be here, but I'm going to put my kid over here. Just like, other kids get there naturally, I'm going to put my kid there. Is that fair to put your kid into the same category as other kids are naturally? Can committees with tall men stop short parents from having taller boys? And I ask this sounds like a joke, but it's not, because when President Clinton had his bioethics committee, which was chaired by Harold Shapiro, the average height of the people on that committee were over on the top end of the curve. So if they said, no, this is not fair, you can't have sons that had the advantages that we had. Basically, that's what they would be saying. Will a child feel differently if his tallness is natural, selected, added in? I have no idea, but neither does anybody else either. So I think that's an important thing to remember. Okay, so what kind of, height's actually complicated. I don't think we're going to get there yet. But there are other kinds of things which are not as complicated, which Charlie's company is trying to analyze, which is that some people, just by chance, are born with advantages. And the most interesting advantages, the ones we're going to figure out first, are protection against cancer, heart disease, other common diseases. Charlie listed all of these diseases. There's natural athletic edge with, if you produce higher levels of erythropoietin in your blood cells, you have greater endurance, ACE, short twitch muscles. These are all differences that exist naturally among people. We're going to figure out what these differences are. And once we figure out what these differences are, people could use that knowledge not to create a superhuman, but just to give their kid alleles, or genes. Scientists call it alleles, other people call it genes, just to give their kids something that other kids get naturally. That's what people could do. The future, genes associated with inborn starting differences, and of course, this doesn't guarantee anything. I always have to say, you can be born with all the musical talents in the world, and if you don't practice the piano, you're not going to be a great musician. We all know that. You can go to Princeton University and go out and collect garbage too. But people realize that there's an increased chance, which is what they're giving their children. All of this stuff is going to be uncovered in the future. So the likely American response to any attempt by the government to ban the use of these, and I call type 1 enhancements because you're just putting in what already exists, is why can't I give my children advantageous genes that other children get naturally? That's what an American will say, basically. That's why Americans accept egg selling. Americans say, well, a woman has the right to control her body. If she wants to sell her eggs, somebody else wants to buy the eggs for $50,000, well, that's an independent transaction. We allow that in America. There is no genetic justice, unfortunately. People have been trying to deny this, but this is a fact. Every child is born at different starting points along thousands of curves that describe different aspects of health, physicality, physiology, personality, and mental attribute. That's just a fact, unfortunately. Every child is born naturally advantaged or disadvantaged along each curve. And by the luck of the draw, some kids get a lot of advantages and few disadvantages. Other kids, unfortunately, get a lot of disadvantages and few of the advantages, especially along the health curves. Life is not fair. So the political issue of the future is who decides how the advantages are distributed. And you got to pick one. There'll be a point when Charlie's company gets us to that point 50 years from now where you got to pick one of these, because it will happen that it will be possible. And you'll say, no, I don't want to do it. If you don't want to do it, you're basically saying, well, if you believe in God, you're saying, I'm putting my faith in God. God's going to choose the genes for my child. If you don't believe in God, you're saying, I'd rather throw the dice. Randomness is better than choosing, is what you're saying. That's number one. Number two, you're saying, I'm going to let the state decide what genes I give to my child. Forget it in America. Or number three, you're going to say the parents, right? Parents should be able to choose what they want for their children as long as they're not hurting their child. And parents should be able to choose. Even if, I mean, I don't really want to go into this, but even if they're hurting their child in America, there's this notion that, a deaf parent can get a sperm donor who's deaf with the same mutation as her to make sure that her child is a deaf child. And there are people in America who support that, even though deafness is commonly thought to be harmful to a child. There could be a time when not making a choice, you're actually choosing God or dice. But basically, people are going to have to realize that. So where's it going to go? So if you're just choosing genes that other kids have naturally, you're not changing the human race. You're just basically changing the frequencies of alleles. That's all you're doing. But there's a bright yellow line here, which there's no technical reason we can't go beyond this line. Beyond the line is beyond humanness. Type 2, what I call type 2 genetic enhancements. Possibilities limited only by our imagination. What are the consequences? Well, so there are two things that are basically define us as humans. One is the way we look, and the other is the way we think. Okay, there are other kinds of things, but those are the main things that define us as human beings. Will there be a change in the appearance? And so, over 5 billion years, our appearance has changed. So we look like this now instead of like that. I honestly don't believe it's going to happen as long as human civilization survives, because I don't think because we have this inborn nature to see other people as being beautiful. Nobody finds this attractive in a romantic way. People find other people attractive, and because of that, I think there's no reason to go beyond human, to be unhuman. I think that would be unattractive. And so I think this is just, we're not going to change in appearance. I mean, there are going to be fads in, thin and high cheekbones, all that kind of stuff, but it's all going to be human, I believe. I think the real question is whether or not there's going to be this, again, I'm coming off of Charlie here. Here's this line of increase in intellectual activity and sort of the evolution of the soul. And this is the question which I have no answer to, which is, will there be a post-human mind or spirit? Leon Kass claims that that is a ridiculous notion. He claims that we have the highest spirit. I don't know none of us can imagine what it even means to have a higher spirit than a human spirit. But, Homo erectus couldn't possibly conceive of what it meant to be Homo sapiens. Okay, which doesn't mean that it's possible. I don't know if it's possible, but that's, I think, an unopened question. And look at the timeline. I'm not talking about this happening tomorrow. I'm talking about the future. How will this happen? Well, it's not going to happen by natural selection as long as the civilization survives, because smarter people don't have more babies. And just remember, natural selection works with, you got to have more babies. Well, it turns out, if you look around, you look at smart people, you look at dumb people, no matter how you describe them, in a liberal democracy, everybody can have babies, and everybody does have babies or doesn't have babies. It has nothing to do with their intelligence. Natural selection won't change the mind spirit. I don't believe, but I think genetic enhancement could, very slowly. So what are the political choices? We could forbid any use of the technology. It's unfair to children born below average health, unfair to children born without natural advantages. We say, forget that. We're not going to allow it. And then basically we're going to keep the unfairness, the random unfairness that exists, is basically what you're saying. Allow parents the choice. Here you have a new unfairness. It's unfair to children born to poor parents, right? So no matter what your choice, it's unfair to one group or another. You say, okay, well, we want to get rid of unfairness. Peter Singer, the philosopher, has suggested, well, either of these are unfair, so what we should do is the state should fund health-related modifications for all citizens. In other words, states should fund all of this, make it available to everybody. This would be unfair to children in poor countries because the state just funds health care just for its own citizens, just like health care today, I should say. Rich children in rich countries can still get increased enhancements beyond those that are state provided, just like health care in many countries today. So there's no solution, basically. If there's free choice, there could be a widening difference. I'm talking about the future. I'm not talking about tomorrow. Widening difference between top and bottom halves of highly industrialized societies. Perhaps, although I think it's much more likely that the difference is going to be between people in rich and poor countries. If you travel around the world, you realize that there's free breeding essentially among all people in America and Western Europe. But there is a huge gap between people in Western countries and underdeveloped countries, and that I don't see people going to these underdeveloped countries and interbreeding with them using a scientific terminology. That's where I think the gap could come into existence. How far could it go? If you imagine the future, generation after generation, genetic enhancements could accumulate in the children of wealthy societies until a severed humanity becomes the ultimate legacy of capitalism. I meant capitalism, not a capitalism. So is that really going to happen? Well, it's not a scientific question. I think it's a political question more than a scientific question. There's some people who think not. John Horgan wrote a book called The End of Science. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, although he now says that's not true because he realizes biotechnology is more powerful than he thought it was. I think it's impossible to predict the future except by accident. I think politics is more difficult to predict than science. But I think that anyone who thinks science or history has come to an end is wrong. I think there's no question that things are going to happen in the future, although we don't know what it's going to be. I also think that it's not scientists who are going to control this technology. I don't think scientists ever control technology. I think it's the people and governments who use scientists who determine how all of these technologies will be used. Will reproductive genetics help humankind as a whole, or will it destroy its very meaning? Or will it do both? I have no idea, and we won't live long enough to find out. Thank you very much. Do you want us both to sit up here, or since we are sort of overlapping?
Is being tall as much of an advantage for women as for men?
No. Just looking at the statistics, no, it's not.
Is it an advantage at all?
I think it's more complicated. I should tell you that the reason that the egg donor sign wanted a 5'10" egg donor was not to have a tall daughter, but to have a tall son. Right? Because the genes are, they're autosomal genes, and you can get a tall son with a tall mother.
No, I just wanted to make a general comment. It was very interesting, but I just want to tell you what I heard on NPR about a year ago. There was a famous woman, I can't really remember, an astrophysicist, in fact, who was being interviewed. And, she said that very often, obviously, they ask her, are there, is there intelligence in other worlds? And she gives the standard answer, well, I mean, it's quite possible because, so many other worlds that it's quite possible. And then she added, but she thinks that it's unlikely, it's very unlikely that there would be intelligent beings. I mean, there would be beings, maybe life, there will be, in other words, but very unlikely that there will be a lot of intelligent beings. And the reason is that they will tend to self-destruct.
Well, I think that's a political question, right? I mean, that's an interesting political debate which we can have over and over again. Is that the natural consequence of intelligence is self-destruction, or are we going to reach this world? I mean, the other alternative, which I didn't mention, is we reach a single united world society where we somehow provide healthcare to all of our children. I mean, forget about genetic engineering. Think about healthcare to all of the children. I mean, is that total fantasy, or are we going to keep on going the way we're going now? Scientists don't have any better way of talking about that than non-scientists.
The question I have, a couple of thoughts, actually. One, is there any comment based on Dolly and other modifications in animals as to what the limits might be? I mean, what's been described this morning is almost, no limits at all, clear blue sky. But is it conceivable that various species simply cannot tolerate a certain level of changes without cascading negative effects? That's one. Two, on the social part of this, isn't this all sort of self-defeating in the end because you get into a genetic arms race? I mean, if 6'3" is a good height, well, 7'3" is even better.
Well, actually, 7'3" is not better.
Well, but if everyone is
Not better today.
everyone hits 6'3", then in the land.
People get 6'3".
Well, under current conditions, but throw that out. That's enough.
Okay, so let me try to answer your first question without getting into the gory technical details. There's a significant difference in the difficulty of cloning Dolly, where you start with an adult cell and try to reroute it back through the embryonic route, and gene-line germ therapy, where you're dealing with embryonic cells. There are still problems, mostly problems with DNA methylation, but I have no reason to think that these are not insolvable. They just will take some tinkering. So I think the technology will mature over probably 10 years to the point where this becomes fairly routine and safe if you want to go there.
In the case of Dolly and some pigs, for example, you see body type changes, you see problems like arthritis or autoimmune disease. How is this doing it in germline, interventions in the germline going to circumvent these sort of problems?
Well, I think there are two separate issues. I mean, problems that arise because of a cloned animal or problems that arise naturally within the species, but as a result.
With genetic intervention.
Well, again, the particular kind of genetic engineering that was done to make Dolly has all kinds of inherent risks and problems. But if you're talking about making transgenic mice just by starting with embryonic stem cells, they're not as healthy as normal, but they're healthy by and large. I mean,
I think the difference is, I mean, there have been tens of thousands of transgenic animals that have been created. And essentially now what scientists can do is they can change single bases, not just genes. You can change single bases. You're working with an embryo. Dolly wasn't actually genetic engineering. Dolly was taking an adult nucleus and trying to make an embryonic. It turns out that that's not as dangerous as everybody thinks it is. That if you actually look at the total number of animals, there's several thousand cloned animals that have come out, the rate of birth defects is 23%. This is a completely different lecture why everybody exaggerates that to make it seem a lot worse than it is, and why everybody thinks arthritis is so awful when I've got arthritis too, and that we wouldn't say to parents, you've got dominant forms of arthritis, you can't have babies. So I think a lot of that has been exaggerated. Nevertheless, I mean, that technology is not as safe as natural reproduction, clearly. But genetic engineering is a totally different thing.
Charles, you said natural selection is the process of finding the best genes for the environment, and you eloquently told us how you can change and control genes. How likely is it that we can control the environment or have created a set of genes that will then not allow us to adapt to a change in the environment in the future?
right. So you're seated in a heated room. All right. So we control the temperature. We control the humidity. We don't control everything in the environment, but I think almost anything specific in the environment that we wanted to control, we, by and large, can. Emergent disease, as with SARS, is clearly something that's not under our control at this point. And I think we never will have 100% control over the environment, but there's no reason to have thick layers of body fat to protect yourself against the cold anymore, although we might have been selected for that in the past.
I just want to add one thing to that. Human beings live in hot, dry deserts. They live in near the North Pole, surrounded by ice. They live in the Amazon, where the humidity is close to 100%. So human beings, basically, because of their intelligence, and they live in outer space for at least, a year at a time. So the environment doesn't stop people right now.
Yeah, so Lee, you just reminded me of something very interesting, though. You may have wondered, why haven't we sent people to Mars? We have the technology to do it as far as the transportation goes. Why hasn't that experiment been done? The answer is because they wouldn't survive the trip. And they wouldn't survive the trip because of radiation damage. And one of the drivers for some forward-looking genetic modification of humans will be if we want space travel. We have to improve the ability to be radiation resistant, and we probably know how to do that.
This is for Lee. When you were talking about the two basic characteristics of humanness, how we look and how we think, and what isn't the second of those kind of narrowly specified by thinking? I can imagine lots of different traits relating to talents of various kinds, to forms of creativity, to even capacities for experiences, aesthetic, and in terms of the acuteness of perception and the like, where there could be very major enhancements, you might say, that didn't have much to do with thinking per se. And maybe you meant thinking to include all of that, but if you
I
expanded
meant
it-
thinking to include all of that. I wasn't be. It's very difficult to find a word to describe the output of the human mind, but I meant to encompass the entire output of the human mind, where, that's how we defined human beings, basically.
In some of the areas that I'm thinking of, forms of creativity, artistic, musical, and otherwise, it's actually involves both mind and body, if you're a singer or if you're a painter or whatever it is. So in terms of some of these psychosomatic capacities that some human beings have to some extent, there's really a lot of interesting possibilities to contemplate in terms of how human beings might be able to live their lives a couple of hundred years from now. So that you may be right that it's more in terms of the basic ways we can do things rather than just how we look. We may be kind of attached to our faces as configurations, but there enhancements of life of other kinds are a multitude.
Well, I think the point I was trying to raise is actually the focus of the seminar, which is, can we change human nature? If we protect ourselves from all these different diseases and we make our stuff longer live, I mean, we're enhancing, but I don't think that's actually changing human nature. I mean, it's not making human beings different than we are right now. A fascinating question, which is really a philosophical question, is, can we evolve human beings into something with a post-human nature? I mean, Francis Fukuyama was the person who made up that kind of term, in the sense that we are beyond our ancestors like Homo erectus. We are post-Homo erectus. Is there such a thing as post-human? I have no idea. I don't know if we ever can imagine whether it could exist, but that's a fascinating philosophical question as far as I'm concerned. And I think what's happening is people are scared to death that we might be going there, and I think a lot of that has sort of this religious notion that God has brought us and this is where we're supposed to be, and we're not supposed to be more godlike, which is what some people think the post-human might be.
So I raised this notion of the silicon carbon camera that I didn't go into in detail, because I think a major driver to change humanity will be to make us more compatible with the silicon world, which has become almost, if you like, the dominant life force on the planet at this point. I have to agree that that's possible, right? Yeah, yeah.
Why don't you think your example of dogs change in nature? Because it certainly bears on the question of the change in nature, possible change in nature.
So the question is, why doesn't I think I think dogs clearly shows that we can change the nature. One of the most interesting things about dog behavior they discovered just recently is that dogs can actually recognize human expressions. And dogs actually have empathy, and and chimpanzees don't. So in other words, because we've co-evolved with dogs, basically, and we've pulled dogs, and dogs that aren't empathetic, we kill, essentially. So we have artificially selected dogs that are empathetic towards human beings. It's a pretty amazing change. And I'm not saying we can't change human nature. What I'm trying to understand is whether we can get to this hypothetical post-human nature, whether such a thing could possibly exist. I mean, maybe this is just semantics. I mean, maybe, we merge with computers and that kind of thing. That will enhance our minds, but will it make us post-human? That's the question I'm trying to understand or ask.
If we're discussing the future of human nature, don't we have to expand far beyond genetics? In other words, don't we also have to include our human environment, for example, our parents, our family, whatever particular, let's say, religious group we're belonging to, our exposures to art, etc. And don't we really have to include the effects of these?
So should we need to include the effects of parents and family and all of those kinds? Those don't define. Those are not unique to humans.
Yeah, they're also part of the environment.
And lots of animals have families and parents, and mouse mothers take care of their offspring, and and elephant mothers have lifelong attachments to their daughters. So that doesn't make the elephants human. I mean, we could, so the question is, do we get rid of those, do we retain them? I don't think we're going to get rid of those. I think those are ingrained, and there's no reason to get rid of family associations. I see no positive advantage to that.
So let me just make a comment which may indirectly address this. I want to stress that we are the consequences of the evolutionary process that brought us here. If you like, we're prisoners of that evolutionary process. And so for good or bad, we have certain traits today which are a memory of that evolution. One is a desire on most people's parts to gorge on fatty food, even though we now believe that that's not healthy, but it was very healthy when you were mostly starving. Another example is the way our visual system processes information, it's highly evolved towards certain kind of things, like being able to see that moving tiger in a forest ahead of you and run the other way. That skill, which occupies a significant part of our visual cortex, is really not needed anymore. It probably could be replaced with something which would be more useful today.
I wonder if we could encourage everybody today to talk about timelines with some specificity. I know this takes guts. You either tell the future or you tell when it happens, but you don't tell both of you have any brains. But Lee, you talked specifically about how you don't think that a lot of this is going to happen in your lifetime. Looking around the room, it looks like there's quite a few people here with 20 or 30 good years left of them, and some maybe have 50 or 60. Why are you so convinced you won't see this?
Well, there's two different parts of that question. Will it happen in our lifetime? Will genetic engineering happen? To a limited extent, actually, some people think it's already happened. There was a paper published just 2 years ago which said the first example of human germline genetic engineering, where they, and I don't want to get into the details because we don't have time for this, where they claim they've already produced a child who had DNA from a third source, and there's mitochondrial DNA. I have no doubt that the science will allow this to happen. I think that the public opposition to this is so strong right now that I think that's going to, that has a lot to do with preventing anybody from perfecting this technology. It's not ready for prime time, basically, because it's not safe, it's not effective, and there's not a threshold yet. I mean, that's the really critical thing. At what threshold will people actually do this? If they can give their kid protection against HIV, I don't think that's enough for parents to actually think they're actually going to go and do this. There has to be a threshold of advantages that parents are going to say, yeah, you know what, it's worth going into this weird technology to give my kid those advantages. I don't know. When do you think that's going to happen?
I think it's going to happen pretty soon. I am really entranced by the China situation, and China's need to, if you haven't seen these numbers, in 50 years from now, the demography of China and India will both be the same as the United States. And there's no conceivable way that they can afford to provide health care to a United States age profile, given any extrapolation of their economic wealth. And I think that's why they're looking at, we have to do something different. I think, unless there are dramatic changes, that this will be pushed, for sure in China and probably in India, just as soon as they can. To me, the key issue that needs to be addressed. The reason why there's such a tremendous cost difference in sperm and egg donors is that being an egg donor, if you've never read the details, is a very, very unpleasant process. So if we can get past that, and I think people will address that, and we'll get past it somehow, so that egg donor is much more important than sperm donor, then this will become easier, and it'll be done.
So I'm in the unlikely position of being on the conservative end of this, so not usually.
When you talk about the resistance to all the kinds of things that these technologies will bring us, it seems to me you emphasize mostly ethical and primarily religious and non-scientific kinds of, that God should be in charge of this, not us, blah, blah, blah. There's that, to be sure. But it seems to me there's a whole other category of objections which have to do with trying to evaluate what the quality of life is going to be like under these new possibilities. both, and two examples I can think of, is will the decisions about human characteristics be made for practical reasons, which will kind of tend to shortchange some of the things that make life valuable and pleasant and precious for us, well, I mean, any number of objections.
Well, so the question is quality of life. I don't see, if we figure out genes that protect against cancer, and you want to give those alleles to your child, I don't see how that could possibly, conceivably, lower the quality of your child's life, because your child's not going to get cancer now, or stroke, or any of these other health advantages. Those are enhancements. Just like, it's just that they're health enhancements. I don't see health enhancements lowering quality of life. What it does is it increases the gap in a societal way between those who can afford it and those who can't afford it. Once you get beyond those kinds of enhancements, then the question is, what are parents going to want to do to their children? I think that most parents are not going to want to restrict their children's future. I think they're going to want to expand their children's future. I mean, if you think about the people in this room, if any of you are thinking to yourself, what could I do for my child? Think what you would do for your child. And you say, well, I can think of certain things I would do for my child to expand her future. Yeah. Are some people going to restrict their kids? Sure, it happens right now. Some people restrict their kids right now. That's not good. But I don't think that's going to be the main desire of parents.
So let me give you an obvious example. I think we're within years of having a human understanding of the longevity genes that have been found in mice and worms. And once we have that understanding, it should then be possible, if you wish, to direct inheritance, probably by germline modification, so that you live 2 times as long or 4 times as long. Now, I don't know whether this is desirable or not, but I am sure there are many parents who will decide that this is desirable for their offspring.
To take that example, just as a special case, how is that going to affect allocation of resources, population as a whole? Who's going to be able to live that long? Things like that.
Yeah, well, I've actually always argued against lengthening the lifespan myself because it will increase the population in direct proportion, everything else being equal. But on the other hand, if the birth rate is being restricted as it is in China and now in India, then maybe you want people to live longer. I keep coming back to the fact that we are, more or less looking at this through our own vantage point, which is highly individual freedoms, highly parents-oriented. And so, we have all these concerns about allocation of resources. I think from if you look at a much more totalitarian situation, I think the concerns are totally different.
I just want to say something about living longer. I mean, what's happening is that as lifespan has increased in industrialized society, the birth rate has decreased much, much faster, and populations are falling. In Japan, there's a population crisis, not because the population is going up, but because the population is falling. It's falling in Italy, it's falling in Russia, it's falling in every country in Western Europe. Living longer will be a disaster if living longer is just living longer and not being productive. It only would make sense and be effective if you live longer with full human capabilities of productivity. Otherwise, it'll be a disaster.
Yeah. So I haven't seen the mice data, but I heard the worm data presented just a few days ago, and the worms that have been engineered to live longer are living happier and healthier, as best one can tell for a worm.
I think that's a critical. It's not just living longer; it's living as youthfully longer.
Okay, with that remark on happy worms, we can take a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes.
Good to hear you. Yeah, indeed. Enjoyed it. Great. Yeah.